Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. Edward here, inviting you into a quieter hour. Tell me, what lingers in your evening? The hush of rain, the soft scratch of pen upon paper, or the gentle ritual of tea? I often imagine Watson in such moments, reflecting as reason quietly takes shape. Do consider subscribing, so these calm inquiries may find you again. Now, settle in, for it is a capital mistake to theorise before one has data, and do visit the Watson's Margins Spotify channel. The link awaits you in the description below. Chapter 1. The Solicitor of Gray's Inn. It was upon a crisp autumn morning in the year 1892 that I found myself accompanying Sherlock Holmes through the ancient precincts of Gray's Inn, and the season had bestowed upon London that peculiar quality of light which seems to sharpen every outline and deepen every shadow, lending to the venerable buildings of the Inns of Court an aspect at once austere and melancholy. The leaves of the plane trees in the square had begun their descent, and they rustled beneath our feet as we made our way toward the chambers of Mr. Alistair Fenwick, Solicitor. Holmes had received a note the previous evening, requesting his attendance upon a matter of some delicacy. The communication had been brief, almost curt, yet something in its phrasing had arrested my friend's attention. He had read it twice, holding the paper to the lamplight, before folding it carefully and placing it in his pocket. "A man of education, Watson," he had remarked, "yet labouring under considerable restraint. Observe the pressure of the pen, the slight tremor in the final lines. Here is one who writes with authority, but not with ease. I had learned long since not to question such pronouncements. Holmes's extraordinary faculty for reading character from the merest physical traces had been demonstrated to me upon too many occasions to admit of doubt. We were shown into Mr. Fenwick's chambers by a clerk of perhaps 50 years, a man whose stooped shoulders and ink-stained fingers spoke of a lifetime spent among documents. He conducted us through an outer office, where two younger clerks bent over their desks with an industry that seemed almost theatrical in its intensity, and into an inner room lined from floor to ceiling with leather-bound volumes and deed boxes. Mr. Alistair Fenwick rose to greet us. He was a man of middle age, perhaps 55, with iron grey hair and a countenance of considerable distinction. His morning coat was immaculate, his manner courteous, yet I detected at once that quality of strain which Holmes had divined from his letter. There was a tightness about the eyes, a certain rigidity in the set of his shoulders, which suggested a man maintaining composure through force of will alone. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I am obliged to you for your promptness," said he, gesturing toward two leather chairs positioned before his desk. "I confess that I find myself in circumstances which, while not perhaps dramatic in the common sense, are none the less deeply troubling to one in my position." Holmes settled into his chair with that peculiar economy of movement which characterised him, and his keen grey eyes already cataloguing the contents of the room. I observed his gaze travel from the safe in the corner, its door slightly ajar, to the papers scattered upon the desk, and thence to a faint discoloration upon the carpet near the window. "You are engaged in a matter of civil litigation," said Holmes without preamble. "A case concerning inheritance, I perceive, and one of considerable antiquity. The difficulty involves documentation, specifically papers, which should be in your possession but are not." Fenwick's composure slipped for an instant, revealing genuine astonishment. "Your reputation is well deserved, sir. I'd prepared a lengthy explanation, yet you have arrived at the essence of the matter before I have spoken a word." "The deduction is elementary," Holmes replied with a wave of his hand. "The volumes immediately to hand upon your shelves concern testamentary law and property conveyance. The papers upon your desk bear the heading of the Chancery Division. As for the antiquity of the case, I observe dust upon certain documents which has been disturbed by recent handling, suggesting materials retrieved from storage. And the missing papers? Your distress is too acute for a mere delay or misfiling. Something is absent which should be present." "You are quite correct," Fenwick acknowledged, his voice dropping to a tone of greater confidence. "I am executor in a matter which has lain dormant for some years, but which has recently required resolution. The estate is substantial, though the circumstances are complicated by certain irregularities in the original settlement. To proceed, I require a set of deposition papers and sworn testimony taken some decades ago, which bear directly upon the question at hand." "And these papers have vanished," Holmes prompted. "They have, Mr. Holmes. I had them in my possession not a fortnight past. I reviewed them myself in preparation for proceedings scheduled to commence next month. They were returned to the safe, of that I am certain. Yet when I sought them 3 days ago, they were nowhere to be found." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "Who has access to your chambers and to that safe?" "Myself, naturally, and Pritchard, my senior clerk, whom you observed in the outer office. The combination is known to no other. I trust Pritchard implicitly. He has been in my employ for 27 years. "Yet you have called upon me rather than the police," Holmes observed. "That suggests either doubt of Pritchard or fear of scandal." Fenwick's hands, which had been resting upon the desk, clenched briefly before relaxing. "Both, perhaps," he admitted, "though I cannot bring myself to believe Pritchard capable of such betrayal, neither can I entirely eliminate the possibility. As for scandal, the case itself involves persons of considerable standing. Any suggestion of irregularity, any whisper of documents gone astray would be most unfortunate." "Tell me of these persons," said Holmes. Over the next quarter hour, Fenwick outlined the principal figures connected with the inheritance matter. There was Mrs. Helena Delamere, a widow of some 60 years, whose claim to certain property formed the heart of the dispute. Then Edwin March, a barrister of Lincoln's Inn, who represented interests opposed to Mrs. Delamere's claim. Finally, there were various other parties, beneficiaries and claimants, whose names Fenwick enumerated but whose relevance seemed less immediate. As Fenwick spoke, I observed Holmes's attention sharpen at certain details, though he gave no outward sign of particular interest. When the solicitor had finished, Holmes rose and approached the safe. "With your permission," said he, and proceeded to examine the lock and hinges with minute care, producing his lens for closer scrutiny. After several moments he straightened. There are no marks of forcing. The safe was opened by one who knew the combination. "Then Pritchard," Fenwick said heavily. "Possibly, though I should like to interview him, and indeed all persons who have visited these chambers in recent weeks. I perceive from the appointment diary upon your desk that you have received several callers." Fenwick nodded slowly. "Mrs. Delamere herself came last Tuesday. Mr. March called the day following. There were others as well, though none entered this inner room." "Nevertheless, I should speak with them all," Holmes said decisively. "Watson, I believe we shall require your notes. This matter, simple though it may appear upon the surface, presents certain features of interest." As we prepared to depart, having arranged to return the following morning to conduct interviews, I observed Fenwick's expression. The relief of having engaged Holmes's services was evident, yet beneath it lay something else, something I could not quite identify. It was a quality of apprehension, and as though the solicitor feared not merely the loss of documents, but the discoveries which their recovery might entail. Holmes, I knew, had observed it too. As we emerged once more into the autumn sunlight of Gray's Inn Square, he remarked quietly, "There is more here than missing papers, Watson. Mark how carefully Fenwick chose his words, how he steered us towards certain facts while avoiding others. We are not being told everything." "Do you suspect him?" I asked. "I suspect everyone until facts prove otherwise," Holmes replied. "But what I find most intriguing is the curious atmosphere of that office. Did you note the clerks? Their industry was too studied, their attention too carefully directed away from our presence. And Pritchard, the trusted servant of 27 years, did not once look up as we passed. No, Watson. We are walking into a web whose strands extend further than Mr. Fenwick has revealed. The game, as I believe I've remarked before, is afoot." With that we turned our steps homeward, while above us the autumn sky deepened toward evening, and the first lamps began to glow in the windows of the ancient inn. Chapter 2. Shadows Beneath Respectability. The following morning found us once again at Gray's Inn. though upon this occasion we were conducted not to Fenwick's private chambers, but to a larger conference room where the solicitor had assembled those persons most intimately connected with the inheritance matter. The room itself was typical of its kind, furnished with a long mahogany table and chairs of severe design, the walls adorned with engravings of distinguished jurists whose stern countenances seemed to pass judgment upon all who entered. Holmes had spent the previous evening in contemplation, seated in his armchair with his fingertips pressed together in that attitude which I had come to recognise as indicative of intense mental activity. He had spoken little, though I observed him consult various reference works upon legal procedure and property law. Whatever conclusions he had drawn, he kept to himself, merely remarking as we departed Baker Street that the day's interviews would prove illuminating. Mr. Fenwick greeted us with a solemnity that suggested the weight of the situation had not diminished overnight. Beside him stood the clerk Pritchard, whose appearance in full daylight revealed a man of faded gentility, his coat carefully brushed yet showing signs of long service, his manner deferential yet possessing a certain quiet dignity. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," Fenwick began, "I have taken the liberty of requesting the attendance of those parties whose interest in this matter is most direct. I trust this arrangement meets with your approval." Holmes inclined his head. "It is precisely what I would have suggested. Efficiency in such matters often serves truth better than prolonged individual interrogations." The door opened to admit a woman whom I took to be Mrs. Helena Delamere. She was a person of commanding presence despite her years, tall and upright in her bearing, dressed in the half-mourning of dove grey that spoke of a bereavement neither recent nor entirely relinquished. Her face retained traces of considerable beauty, though time and, I fancied, some deep-seated sorrow had etched lines about her mouth and eyes. She acknowledged our introduction with a slight inclination of her head, her voice when she spoke possessing a cultivated precision. "I confess myself bewildered by this summons," said she, settling into a chair with practised grace. "Mr. Fenwick has explained that certain documents have gone astray, yet I fail to comprehend how my presence might assist in their recovery." "Your patience is appreciated, madam," Holmes replied. "I have found that in matters of missing items, those who stand to benefit from their absence often prove as valuable as those who might benefit from their presence." A flicker of something passed across Mrs. Delamere's features, too swift to identify with certainty, yet leaving an impression of wariness. Before she could respond, a second arrival claimed our attention. Mr. Edwin March entered with the measured tread of one accustomed to the formality of courtrooms. He was perhaps 40 years of age, lean and angular in build, with features that suggested habitual reserve. His dress was irreproachable, his manner courteous, yet there emanated from him an atmosphere of careful control, as though every word and gesture were subject to internal scrutiny before expression. He greeted Mrs. Delamere with a bow of studied neutrality, acknowledged Fenwick with professional courtesy, and regarded Holmes and myself with the assessing gaze of one who measures potential adversaries. "Mr. March," said Fenwick, "thank you for attending at such short notice." "Mr. Sherlock Holmes has been engaged to investigate the disappearance of certain deposition papers essential to our proceedings." March's expression remained impassive. "I had heard rumours of some irregularity. I trust the matter will be resolved without disrupting the scheduled hearing." "That is my earnest hope," Fenwick replied, though I detected a note of uncertainty in his voice. Holmes had positioned himself near the window, from which vantage point he could observe all present without appearing to do so. I had taken a chair somewhat apart, my notebook at hand, ready to record such details as might prove significant. As I surveyed the assembled company, I was struck by the peculiar atmosphere that pervaded the room. It was not precisely hostility, nor yet mere professional formality, but rather a quality of suppressed tension, as though each person present laboured under some private burden, which the current situation threatened to expose. Holmes began with questions of an apparently innocuous nature, establishing the timeline of recent visits to Fenwick's chambers, the nature of each party's interest in the inheritance dispute, and their familiarity with the specific deposition papers now missing. Mrs. Delamere responded with measured care, acknowledging that she had visited Fenwick's office the previous Tuesday to discuss certain aspects of her claim, though she insisted she had remained in the outer office throughout, and had not approached the safe or indeed been aware of its contents. The papers in question, she said, were mentioned to me only in the most general terms. I understood them to contain testimony relevant to the original settlement, but I was given no details of their substance. March, when his turn came, displayed equal circumspection. He confirmed his visit upon the Wednesday, explained that his purpose had been to review the schedule of proceedings, and stated with some emphasis that he had no knowledge of the deposition papers beyond their existence as items listed in the case file. I deal with such matters at a level of legal principle, he observed. The specific content of historical depositions, while doubtless significant, is not my immediate concern. Throughout these exchanges, Holmes maintained an attitude of polite attention, interjecting occasional questions that seemed designed less to elicit specific information than to observe the respondent's reaction. He inquired of Mrs. Delamere regarding her late husband's involvement in property transactions some decades past. He asked March about his own history at the bar and his familiarity with cases dating from the early 1870s. To Pritchard, he posed questions about the filing systems employed in the office and the security measures governing sensitive documents. Each question, innocent though it appeared, produced a subtle effect. Mrs. Delamere's composure, while never entirely deserting her, showed momentary strain when the subject turned to her husband's business dealings. March, whose professional detachment had seemed absolute, betrayed a flicker of something resembling discomfort when Holmes mentioned specific dates from 20 years previous. Pritchard, questioned about his long service with Fenwick, exhibited an anxiety disproportionate to the nature of the inquiry, his hands trembling slightly as he explained the procedures for document storage. What struck me most forcibly, however, was the pattern of evasion that characterized their responses. None spoke falsely, so far as I could determine, yet neither did any speak with complete candour. There were hesitations before answering, careful selections of phrase, and a tendency to provide information that, while factually accurate, somehow failed to illuminate the matter at hand. Holmes appeared to note these peculiarities with satisfaction, though he gave no sign of attaching particular significance to them. When the interviews concluded, he thanked each participant with scrupulous courtesy and assured them that their cooperation would prove valuable to the investigation. As the room emptied, Fenwick detained us with a gesture. "What is your assessment, Mr. Holmes? Do you perceive any indication of guilt among those you have questioned?" Holmes regarded him thoughtfully. "I perceive something rather more interesting than simple guilt, Mr. Fenwick. I perceive fear. Each person in this room, yourself not excluded, carries some burden connected with those missing papers. The question is not merely who removed them, but why their disappearance should cause such evident distress to parties who claim only professional or financial interest in their contents." Fenwick's face paled. "I assure you, Mr. Holmes, my concern is entirely professional." "Perhaps," Holmes replied. "Yet I observe that when I mentioned the 1870s, your own expression altered. You are younger than Mrs. Delamere and somewhat older than Mr. March, which would place you at perhaps 30 years of age in that period. Old enough to be engaged in legal practice, young enough to be subject to influences you might later regret." "This is mere speculation," Fenwick protested, though his voice lacked conviction. "Undoubtedly," Holmes agreed. "Speculation, however, often precedes discovery. I shall require access to your older records, Mr. Fenwick, particularly those relating to property cases concluded between 1870 and 1875. I shall also need a complete account of the original inheritance matter that gave rise to the present dispute." Fenwick hesitated, then nodded slowly. "I shall have Pritchard prepare the files. They are stored in the basement archive and may require some hours to retrieve." As we departed into the autumn afternoon, Holmes maintained a thoughtful silence. We had walked some distance along High Holborn before he spoke. "The matter deepens, Watson. We are not dealing with simple theft, nor even with a straightforward attempt to suppress evidence. There is history here, old history, and it casts a long shadow. Did you observe how carefully each person avoided any direct reference to the past? They spoke of the present dispute, of legal technicalities and procedural matters, yet the moment I touched upon events of 20 years ago, the very air in that room seemed to thicken with unspoken memory." "You believe they are all complicit?" I asked. "I believe they are all connected," Holmes corrected. "Whether by complicity or merely by unfortunate association I cannot yet say. But mark this, Watson. The missing deposition papers are not valuable for what they might reveal about property rights. They are dangerous for what they might reveal about the people assembled in that room today. And until we understand what occurred 2 decades ago, we shall not comprehend what has occurred this week." The gas lamps were beginning to glow as we reached Baker Street, and I found myself reflecting upon the curious assembly we'd just left. Each had appeared the very model of Victorian respectability, yet beneath that polished surface something darker stirred, something that connected them all to a past they were desperate to keep buried. Chapter 3. The Crime Unfolds. 2 days elapsed before we heard again from Gray's Inn, and those days were occupied by Holmes in pursuits that seemed to bear no direct relation to the missing deposition papers. He spent long hours at Somerset House, examining records whose significance he declined to explain. He made inquiries at the Law Society regarding barristers and solicitors who had practiced during the 1870s. He even ventured into the dusty repositories of newspaper archives, emerging with ink-stained fingers and a preoccupied expression that I had learned not to interrupt with questions. On the 3rd morning, however, our investigations took a turn both sudden and alarming. We had scarcely finished breakfast when a boy arrived bearing an urgent message from Pritchard. The note was brief and agitated, quite unlike the measured prose we had encountered previously, and it requested our immediate attendance upon a matter of grave emergency. We hastened at once to Gray's Inn, where we found the chambers in a state of considerable disorder. The outer office, which had previously presented an aspect of professional calm, now contained several constables and a harassed-looking inspector, who I recognised as Gregson of Scotland Yard. Pritchard stood to one side, his face ashen, wringing his hands in evident distress. "Mr. Holmes, thank heaven you have come," he cried as we entered. "It is dreadful, perfectly dreadful. Mr. Fenwick has been attacked, the safe broken into. I discovered him not an hour since." Holmes's manner became instantly alert, though he preserved his customary composure. "Where is Mr. Fenwick now?" "In his inner chamber," Gregson replied, approaching us with that mixture of professional courtesy and barely concealed scepticism which characterised his dealings with Holmes. "He was found unconscious at his desk. The police surgeon has examined him and believes he sustained a blow to the head, though there is no great injury. He has been conveyed to his residence under medical supervision." "Show me," said Holmes simply, and we proceeded into Fenwick's private office. The scene that met our eyes was one of apparent violence, yet something in its arrangement struck me as peculiar even before Holmes began his examination. The safe door stood open, its lock mechanism damaged in a manner suggesting forcible entry. Papers were scattered across the floor and desk in seeming confusion. A chair lay overturned near the window. Yet despite these evidences of struggle, certain items remained undisturbed. A small bronze statuette upon the mantelpiece stood precisely in its place. The inkwell upon the desk had not been upset. The books upon the shelves maintained their orderly alignment. Holmes moved about the room with that peculiar concentration which characterised his investigative method, examining each detail with minute attention. He scrutinised the safe mechanism through his lens, tested the papers scattered upon the floor, and devoted particular attention to the area surrounding the overturned chair. I observed him collect several items, including what appeared to be fibres from the carpet, and a fragment of paper bearing a partial watermark. "The villain entered through the door, I perceive," said Gregson with an air of confidence. "There are scratches upon the lock consistent with picking. He overcame Mr. Fenwick, forced the safe, and made off with whatever documents he sought." Holmes straightened from his examination of the safe. "You believe Mr. Fenwick was present during the intrusion?" "Stands to reason, doesn't it? He was found at his desk, struck down while working late." "At what hour was he discovered?" "Shortly after 8 this morning," Pritchard interjected. "I arrive at 7:30 customarily, but Mr. Fenwick had requested I come somewhat later today. When I entered at 8, I found the outer door unlocked and Mr. Fenwick slumped across his desk." "The outer door was unlocked," Holmes repeated thoughtfully. "Yet you state that Mr. Fenwick had requested you come later than usual. Did he often work through the night?" Pritchard shook his head. "Never to my knowledge, sir. Well, he was most regular in his habits." Holmes turned to examine the damaged lock of the outer door. After a moment he produced a small scratch upon the metal. "This mark is fresh, certainly. Yet observe, Gregson, how shallow it is. A man truly forcing this lock would have gouged more deeply. This has the appearance of damage intended to suggest forced entry rather than actual necessity." Gregson frowned. "You think the door was opened normally, and the scratches added afterward?" "I think nothing as yet," Holmes replied. "I merely observe. Tell me, Pritchard, what documents appear to be missing from the safe?" The clerk approached with visible reluctance and examined the contents of the safe, comparing them against a ledger he produced from a drawer. His agitation increased as he worked, and when he finally spoke, his voice trembled. "Several files are disturbed, Mr. Holmes, though none appear to be entirely missing save the deposition papers we have already discussed. But other documents have been examined, moved about. The organisation is quite destroyed." "Someone was searching," I ventured. "Perhaps," said Holmes. "Or perhaps someone wished to create that impression. Observe the pattern of disturbance. The files relating to current cases remain largely untouched, while those dealing with older matters have been most thoroughly examined. Our intruder, if intruder there was, showed remarkable discrimination in his search." We were interrupted by the arrival of a police surgeon, who reported that Mr. Fenwick had regained consciousness and was demanding to speak with the authorities. Holmes at once requested permission to interview him, and Gregson, though clearly dubious of the value of such a proceeding, consented to accompany us. We found Fenwick at his residence in Bloomsbury, a comfortable establishment that spoke of professional success without ostentation. He had been settled in his study, his head bandaged, his complexion pale but his manner alert. Upon our entrance he attempted to rise, but Holmes gestured him to remain seated. "Mr. Fenwick, you have suffered a considerable shock. Pray do not tax yourself unnecessarily." "Mr. Holmes, it is good of you to come. I must tell you what occurred, though I fear my account will prove disappointingly vague." Fenwick pressed a hand to his bandaged temple. "I remained late at Chambers last evening, reviewing certain files related to our matter. I believe it was approaching 10 o'clock when I heard a sound from the outer office. Before I could investigate, someone entered my room. I had an impression of a figure, a raised arm, and then nothing, until I woke this morning with Pritchard hovering over me in great distress." "You saw nothing of your assailant's features?" Holmes inquired. "Nothing distinct. The lamp upon my desk cast shadows, and the attack was so sudden." "Yet you were not robbed of your personal effects. Your watch remains, your purse untouched." Fenwick nodded slowly. The motive was clearly connected with the case. The missing deposition papers, the safe forced open. Someone is determined to suppress evidence. Holmes rose and moved to the window, gazing out upon the street below. "That is certainly one interpretation. Tell me, Mr. Fenwick, had you made progress in your own investigation of the paper's initial disappearance?" A curious expression crossed Fenwick's features. "I had been reviewing old files, yes, attempting to understand the context of the original testimony." "And had you discovered anything of significance?" There was a pause, during which I observed Fenwick's struggle between candour and discretion. I had begun to perceive certain connections, he admitted finally. Matters I had not previously considered relevant. Connections to the past, Holmes suggested quietly. Yes. We departed shortly thereafter, leaving Fenwick to his rest and Gregson to his theories of common burglary. As our cab rattled through the London streets, Holmes sat in deep contemplation. "What make you of it, Watson?" he asked at length. I considered the evidence. It appears straightforward enough. Someone seeking the deposition papers, finding them already gone, attacked Fenwick in the hope of learning their whereabouts. A reasonable hypothesis, yet certain elements trouble me. Consider the reactions we observed this morning. Pritchard was genuinely distressed, his alarm almost excessive. Yet when we encountered Gregson, did you note his demeanour? He seemed competent enough, I replied, somewhat puzzled. Indeed, but consider what he did not do. He did not express surprise at our arrival, though Pritchard's message to us was ostensibly private. He did not question why we should be summoned to what appeared a simple case of assault and burglary. It was as though our involvement was expected, even anticipated. You suspect Gregson? I suspect nothing and everyone, Holmes replied. But I'm increasingly convinced that we are witnessing not a crime, but a performance. The forced safe, the scattered papers, the convenient unconsciousness of the one witness who might identify the perpetrator. Even Fenwick's vague description serves a purpose, does it not? It tells us nothing while appearing to tell us everything. Then you believe Fenwick himself arranged this? Holmes shook his head. That I do not say, but consider this. 3 individuals expressed unease when questioned about the past. Within days, one is attacked in a manner calculated to shift attention from historical inquiry to present danger. The deposition papers, already missing, now become the focus of violent crime rather than mere misplacement. And all our suspects, as they must now be termed, I have their reactions to this new development already prepared and performed. He fell silent, and I did not press him further. We had entered deeper waters than I had initially supposed, and I found myself reflecting upon the curious pattern Holmes had identified. If this was indeed a performance, then we had been provided with our assigned roles as well. The question was whether we would play them as expected, or whether Holmes would, as so often before, rewrite the script to reveal the truth beneath the theatrical display. The afternoon was growing late as we returned to Baker Street, and the lengthening shadows seemed to mirror the darkening complexity of our investigation. Chapter 4. Ink and Erasure. The days following the attack upon Fenwick brought a flurry of activity that seemed to Holmes insufficient compensation for the lack of genuine progress. Gregson pursued his theory of an external intruder with admirable diligence, interviewing caretakers and night watchmen, examining pawn shops for evidence of stolen documents, and generally conducting the sort of methodical investigation that characterises Scotland Yard at its most competent. Yet for all this industry, no arrest was made, no suspect identified, and the missing deposition papers remained as elusive as ever. Holmes, meanwhile, had secured permission to examine such documents as remained in Fenwick's possession, and it was to this task that he devoted himself with characteristic intensity. Fenwick had arranged for the relevant files to be delivered to Baker Street, where they now occupied a substantial portion of our sitting room, transforming it into a temporary archive of legal history. I found Holmes one morning surrounded by these papers, his dressing gown wrapped about him against the autumn chill, his pipe sending up clouds of acrid smoke as he bent over a particular document with his magnifying lens. Upon the table before him lay an array of items that spoke of his investigative method: bottles of chemical reagents, samples of different inks, specimens of paper bearing various watermarks, and a collection of reference works on document examination. "Ah, Watson," said he without looking up, "you're opportunely arrived. I have made certain discoveries that may prove illuminating, though they serve rather to deepen the mystery than to resolve it." I drew a chair beside him and observed the document under his scrutiny. It appeared to be a legal draft relating to the inheritance matter, dated some 3 years previous, covered in the precise handwriting of professional clerks. "What have you found?" I inquired. Holmes set down his lens and leaned back, steepling his fingers in that gesture which indicated a problem of unusual interest. "I have found, Watson, that our missing deposition papers are not the only documents to have suffered interference. Observe this draft settlement." He indicated the paper before him. "What do you perceive?" I examined it carefully. It appears perfectly ordinary. Legal terminology, formal structure, properly witnessed and signed. "Look more closely at this passage here." Holmes pointed to a section detailing certain property boundaries. "Do you observe anything unusual about the ink?" I peered at the indicated text. Perhaps a slight variation in shade, though it might be merely the effect of aging. An understandable conclusion, yet incorrect. The variation you perceive results not from aging but from erasure and overwriting. Someone has altered this passage, substituting new text for old with sufficient skill that casual examination would reveal nothing amiss. He produced a bottle of chemical solution and applied a small quantity to the margin of the document, where a faint trace of earlier writing became momentarily visible before fading once more. The original text referenced a different set of boundary markers, Watson. Markers that would, I suspect, substantially alter the property lines in question. "Good heavens," I exclaimed. "Then the entire inheritance claim may rest upon falsified documentation." "So it would appear, but observe further." Holmes selected another document, this one bearing the heading of a surveyor's report. Here we find dates that have been similarly altered. The survey was originally conducted in 1873, yet the date now reads 1875, a difference of 2 years, Watson, which may seem trivial until one considers what might have transpired during that interval. Over the course of the next hour, Holmes demonstrated to me a pattern of subtle manipulations extending across multiple documents. Passages had been erased and rewritten. Dates had been altered. References to certain individuals had been removed or modified. The work had been done with considerable expertise, suggesting someone intimately familiar with legal documentation and possessing both the skill and the nerve to commit such forgery. "The question," said Holmes, "is whether these alterations were made recently, in connection with the current dispute, or whether they date from the original preparation of these documents decades ago." "Can you determine which?" I asked. "I can make certain observations. The paper upon which these documents are written bears watermarks consistent with manufacture in the early 1870s. The ink, however, presents a more complex problem. Some passages employ an iron gall ink formulation common to that period, while others show traces of more recent synthetic dyes. This suggests alterations made at different times, possibly by different hands." He rose and began to pace, his pipe sending up fresh clouds of smoke. "We are confronted with a palimpsest, Watson. Layers of deception, one atop another, extending back through the years. The missing deposition papers, I am increasingly convinced, represent the original, unaltered testimony. Their disappearance serves to protect not one fraud but a succession of them." Our discussion was interrupted by the arrival of a visitor, announced by Mrs. Hudson with an expression suggesting disapproval of the irregular hours we were keeping. The caller proved to be none other than Edwin March, who entered with an air of barely suppressed agitation quite at variance with his previous composure. "Mr. Holmes, forgive this intrusion," said he, in declining the seat I offered. "I have learned disturbing news that I felt obliged to communicate immediately." "Pray continue," Holmes replied, resuming his own seat and regarding March with alert interest. "I have been approached," March began, choosing his words with evident care, "by a person claiming to possess information regarding the missing deposition papers. The approach was made anonymously through a letter delivered to my chambers. The writer suggests that the papers might be recovered in exchange for a substantial sum." Holmes accepted the letter March extended and examined it closely. "The hand is disguised, the paper common enough to be purchased at any stationer. The proposition itself is straightforward blackmail. What response have you made? None as yet. I wished first to consult with you and with Mr. Fenwick. The sum demanded is considerable, £500, yet not entirely beyond reach if the restoration of the papers would serve to resolve this matter. And you believe they would? Holmes asked mildly. March hesitated. I believe their continued absence serves no one's interest. The hearing cannot proceed without them. The entire inheritance matter remains in suspension. Surely it would be preferable to recover them by whatever means necessary. Even if such recovery serves to conceal the truth of how they disappeared, Holmes observed. For you must acknowledge, Mr. March, that payment of this demand would effectively end all investigation into the original theft. A flush rose to March's cheeks. I acknowledge only that prolonged uncertainty damages all parties. If the papers can be recovered, the question of who took them becomes academic. Holmes studied him for a long moment. Tell me, Mr. March, in your professional capacity, have you examined the documents relating to this inheritance matter with the attention to detail that your training would suggest? I have reviewed the case file, naturally, and observed nothing unusual, no irregularities in the documentation, no inconsistencies in dates or descriptions. March's expression became guarded. Legal documents from that period often contain minor inconsistencies. The standards of record-keeping were less rigorous than today. Indeed, Holmes replied. Yet some inconsistencies suggest not mere laxity, but deliberate alteration. I put it to you, Mr. March, that you're aware of such alterations and that your eagerness to recover the deposition papers stems less from a desire to proceed with the hearing than from a wish to prevent close examination of the documents that remain. The colour drained from March's face as swiftly as it had risen. This is outrageous speculation, Mr. Holmes. I came here in good faith. Then demonstrate that good faith by answering my question directly. Have you knowledge of document tampering in this case? March drew himself up stiffly. I am a member of the bar, Mr. Holmes. Any suggestion that I would countenance, much less participate in, such conduct is deeply offensive. I made no accusation, Holmes said quietly. I merely asked a question. Your indignation, while understandable, serves also as an evasion. March turned to leave, then paused at the door. I had hoped for your assistance, Mr. Holmes. Instead, I find myself subjected to unfounded insinuations. Good day to you both. When he had gone, I turned to Holmes with some concern. You have made an enemy there, I fear. Perhaps, or perhaps I have rattled a guilty conscience. Did you observe his reaction when I mentioned document alteration? The surprise was genuine, Watson, but it was followed immediately by calculation. He's wondering how much I know and how much I merely suspect. Do you believe he's involved in the forgeries you discovered? Holmes returned to his examination of the papers. I believe March knows more than he has revealed. Whether that knowledge extends to direct participation or merely to uncomfortable awareness, I cannot yet say. But mark this. Watson, we are now presented with multiple motives for the suppression of those deposition papers. First, their content itself, whatever damaging testimony they contain. Second, their authenticity, which would expose the alterations made to other documents. And third, the financial motive suggested by this attempted blackmail. He held up the anonymous letter. 3 distinct motives, Watson, yet I am inclined to believe they all spring from a single source. The past, that buried history which all our principles are so desperate to keep concealed. Until we uncover what truly occurred 20 years ago, we shall continue to stumble through this maze of misdirection. The afternoon was advancing toward evening, and the familiar sounds of Baker Street drifted through our windows. Yet within our sitting room, surrounded by documents both genuine and falsified, we seemed to inhabit a different realm entirely, one where the past refused to remain past, and where truth had been so thoroughly obscured that recovering it would require all of a Holmes's formidable capabilities. I could not shake the feeling that we were being led in circles, presented with clues and complications that seemed designed to confuse rather than illuminate. Holmes, however, appeared energized rather than discouraged by the challenge. and I knew him well enough to recognise that this was precisely the sort of problem to which his unique talents were best suited. Chapter 5. The Echo of an Old Case. Holmes's investigation now turned decisively toward the past, and I found myself accompanying him upon a series of expeditions that took us far from the familiar precincts of Baker Street. We visited the offices of provincial newspapers, seeking accounts of legal proceedings from the 1870s. We spent long hours in the reading rooms of the British Museum poring over records of property transactions and court judgments. Holmes even secured an interview with a retired judge whose memory of cases from that period proved remarkably acute. It was upon the fourth day of these researches that Holmes made the discovery, which would prove central to unravelling the entire mystery. We had travelled to Somerset, to a small market town whose name I shall not specify, where Holmes had learned that certain land records dating from the period in question were preserved in the local courthouse. The journey had been tedious, the accommodations indifferent, yet Holmes's spirits remained high throughout, sustained by that peculiar energy which the pursuit of truth always kindled in him. The records clerk, a wizened gentleman of perhaps 70 years, greeted us with the cautious hospitality of one accustomed to infrequent visitors. When Holmes explained the nature of our inquiry, however, the old man's face brightened with something approaching enthusiasm. "Ah, you'll be wanting the Ashworth matter," said he, leading us into a dusty archive room. "I was but a young clerk myself when that case was heard, but I remember it well. Caused quite a sensation locally, though it never reached the London papers." "The Ashworth matter?" Holmes prompted, though I detected in his tone a note of satisfaction, as though this was precisely what he had expected to hear. "Indeed, sir, a dispute over land boundaries between the Ashworth estate and certain tenants who claimed ancient rights of access. Complicated business, with surveys and counter-surveys, depositions from elderly witnesses, examination of documents going back centuries." The clerk pulled down a heavy ledger from a high shelf and blew the dust from its covers. "Here we are. The case was heard in the spring of 1873. Holmes examined the ledger with minute attention, occasionally making notes in his pocketbook. After some time, he looked up with an expression of grim understanding. "The case was settled before judgment, I perceive." "Aye, sir, most unusual that. After weeks of testimony, the parties reached agreement quite suddenly. The terms were not made public, being part of a private settlement, but the case was withdrawn from the docket and never resumed." "And the principal parties? What became of them?" The clerk's face grew sombre. "That's the tragic part, sir. Not 6 months after the settlement, young Mr. Ashworth died in a riding accident. Terrible business. He was but 30 years of age, newly married, with every prospect before him. The estate passed to a distant cousin, but by then the land in question had been sold off, and the entire matter seemed to fade from memory." Holmes questioned the clerk minutely about the details of the case, the identities of the legal representatives, the nature of the testimony given. As the old man spoke, I began to perceive connections that sent a chill through me. The widowed client mentioned by the clerk bore a maiden name that suggested she might be related to Mrs. Delamere. The solicitor who had represented the Ashworth interest had chambers in Gray's Inn, and among the witnesses deposed had been a young surveyor whose Christian name was Edwin. When we departed the courthouse, Holmes was silent for some time, walking with that rapid, purposeful stride which indicated intense mental activity. We had nearly reached our hotel before he spoke. "The pattern emerges, Watson. 20 years ago, in this very district, a case was heard which involved all our current principals, though they were then younger and occupied different positions. The settlement of that case was sudden and I suspect far from equitable. Young Ashworth's subsequent death removed the one party who might have challenged the arrangement. And now, 2 decades later, the inheritance dispute that brought us to Fenwick's chambers threatens to expose what occurred." "You believe Ashworth's death was not accidental?" I asked. "I believe nothing without proof," Holmes replied. "But I observe that his death was remarkably convenient for certain parties, and that the official verdict of accident was reached without extensive inquiry. I observe also that the deposition papers now missing would have contained testimony given before that settlement, testimony uninfluenced by whatever inducements or pressures led to its conclusion. We returned to London the following day, and Holmes immediately requested interviews with each of our principals. He began with Mrs. Delamere, our calling upon her at her residence in Kensington. She received us in a drawing-room of faded elegance, its furnishings speaking of better days long past. Holmes wasted no time in preliminaries. "Mrs. Delamere, I must ask you directly about your connection to the Ashworth case of 1873. The effect of his words was immediate and profound. Mrs. Delamere's composure, which had withstood our previous interviews, shattered entirely. Her face went pale, and she gripped the arm of her chair as though to steady herself. "How did you—" she began, then stopped. I had not thought anyone would remember. It was so long ago. "I remember very little," Holmes said more gently. "I know only that such a case existed and that you were connected with it. And I should be grateful if you would enlighten me as to the nature of that connection." Mrs. Delamere rose and moved to the window, gazing out upon the street below. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I was Helena Ashworth then. James Ashworth was my husband. We had been married less than a year when the dispute began over the estate boundaries. It seemed at first a simple matter, the sort of disagreement that arises between landowners and tenants in every generation. But it grew complicated, bitter. There were accusations of fraud regarding the original surveys, suggestions that documents had been forged to support our claim. "Were they forged?" Holmes asked quietly. "I did not know then. I was young, newly married, trusting. My husband assured me all was well, that our solicitor was managing the affair competently. But as the case progressed, I began to perceive that James was under great strain. He had private meetings with his legal advisers from which I was excluded. He spoke of compromises that troubled him, and then, quite suddenly, the case was settled on terms that seemed to give away much of what we had claimed. And 6 months later he died." Mrs. Delamere turned from the window, tears glistening in her eyes. "The riding accident. Everyone said it was simply misfortune, a stumble on a familiar path. But James had been an excellent horseman. He had ridden that route 100 times without incident. I have lived for 20 years with the question of whether it was truly an accident, or whether he was silenced because he knew too much and his conscience would not let him remain silent." Holmes leaned forward. "The deposition papers that are now missing, they contain testimony given during that case?" "I believe so. When Mr. Fenwick began investigating the current inheritance claim, he discovered that the land in question had originally been part of the Ashworth estate. The terms of that old settlement, the circumstances of James's death, the subsequent disposal of the property, all of it became relevant once more, and those depositions, if they still existed, would show what testimony was given before the settlement, before whatever arrangement was made to conclude the case quietly." "Who else from that time is connected with the current matter?" Holmes pressed. Mrs. Delamere returned to her seat, her earlier composure partially restored by the relief of confession. "Edwin March was the surveyor who testified regarding the boundary markers. He was very young then, just establishing his career. Mr. Fenwick himself was the junior solicitor in chambers that represented the opposing interests, and Pritchard, he was a clerk even then, working for the same firm. A convenient gathering," Holmes observed, "all parties to that old case, reunited by circumstance around a new dispute that threatens to expose the old one. Tell me, Mrs. Delamere, do you believe your husband's death was murder?" She met his gaze steadily. "I believe someone benefited from his silence, Mr. Holmes. Whether they contrived his death or merely welcomed it, I cannot say. But I have never believed it was simple accident, and now those deposition papers have vanished, just as the truth seems within reach once more. That cannot be coincidence." We took our leave shortly thereafter, and as our hansom carried us back toward Baker Street, I found my mind reeling with the implications of what we had learned. "The entire matter revolves around that old case," I said. But if Mrs. Delamere's suspicions are correct, if her husband was indeed murdered to ensure his silence, then we are dealing with something far graver than mere document theft. We are dealing with the long shadow of the past, Holmes replied. 20 years ago, something occurred that certain parties were desperate to conceal. Documents were forged, testimony was suppressed, and a young man died under circumstances that conveniently prevented further inquiry. Those same parties now find themselves threatened by the resurrection of that case. The missing deposition papers are dangerous not for what they reveal about property boundaries, Watson, but for what they reveal about the methods used to settle the original dispute. Then all our principals, Fenwick, March, Pritchard, they were all involved in this wrongdoing. Involved, certainly, Holmes said. Whether as principals or merely as instruments, whether willingly or under coercion, remains to be determined. But they are bound together by shared knowledge of events they have spent 2 decades attempting to forget. And now that knowledge has become a weapon, turned upon them by one of their own number, or by someone who has discovered their secret. The fog was descending as we reached Baker Street, wrapping the familiar thoroughfare in grey obscurity. It seemed a fitting metaphor for the case itself, where the truth lay shrouded in the mists of time, visible only in fragmentary glimpses, yet inexorably drawing nearer with each step of Holmes's investigation. Chapter 6. A Pact of Silence. The revelation of Mrs. Delamere's true identity and her connection to the Ashworth case had provided Holmes with a foundation upon which to build his theory, yet many questions remained unanswered. Chief among these was the precise nature of the wrongdoing that had occurred 20 years previous, and the degree to which each of our principals had participated in it. Holmes devoted the following days to pursuing these inquiries with a tenacity that left me both exhausted and admiring. He secured interviews with elderly residents of the Somerset district where the Ashworth estate had been located, eliciting from them fragments of memory and gossip that, when assembled, began to form a coherent picture. He examined death records and coroner's reports, noting inconsistencies and omissions that suggested a less than thorough investigation. He even travelled to the site of the riding accident that had claimed James Ashworth's life, examining the terrain with that meticulous attention to physical evidence which characterised his method. It was upon a grey afternoon, with rain pattering against the windows of Baker Street, that Holmes finally assembled the complete narrative. He had invited Fenwick to call upon us, ostensibly to discuss the progress of the investigation, though I suspected his true purpose was rather different. The solicitor arrived promptly at the appointed hour, his manner guarded, his eyes betraying the strain of recent weeks. "Mr. Fenwick," Holmes began, "once our visitor was seated and had declined the offer of refreshment, I have made considerable progress in understanding the disappearance of the deposition papers. That progress, however, has taken me in directions I had not initially anticipated. I find myself investigating not merely a theft, but a tragedy extending back 2 decades. Fenwick's composure faltered. "I do not take your meaning, Mr. Holmes." "I think you do," Holmes replied, his tone gentle yet implacable. "I have learned of the Ashworth case. I have spoken with Mrs. Delamere, who was then Mrs. Ashworth. I have examined the records of that case and the circumstances of James Ashworth's death. What I have discovered troubles me greatly." "That case was concluded long ago," Fenwick said, though his voice lacked conviction. It has no bearing on the current matter." "On the contrary, it has everything to do with the current matter. Indeed, I have come to believe that the current matter exists solely because of what occurred then." Holmes rose and began to pace, his hands clasped behind his back. "Let me reconstruct the events as I understand them, and you shall correct me if I err." Fenwick made no reply, merely settling deeper into his chair as though bracing himself against an expected blow. "In 1873, Holmes continued, a dispute arose concerning land boundaries of the Ashworth estate. The case was complex, resting upon the interpretation of ancient surveys and the testimony of witnesses to events long past. Young James Ashworth believed himself the rightful owner of certain parcels which had been occupied for generations by tenant farmers. Those tenants, represented by capable legal counsel, contested his claim with equal vigour. "This is all a matter of public record," Fenwick interjected. "Indeed. What is less publicly recorded is the manner in which the case was prosecuted. Edwin March, then a surveyor of limited experience but considerable ambition, was engaged to examine the historical boundaries. His conclusions supported the tenant's claim, undermining Ashworth's position significantly. Yet I have obtained copies of March's original field notes, Watson, through correspondence with his former employer. Those notes tell a rather different story than his formal testimony." I observed Fenwick's hands tighten upon the arms of his chair, though he remained silent. March's original observation supported Ashworth's claim, Holmes stated flatly. The boundary markers he identified, the measurements he recorded, all vindicated the estate's position. Yet his formal testimony reversed these findings entirely. Why would a young professional, at the beginning of his career, commit such perjury? "You're speculating," Fenwick said, though the words emerged with difficulty. "I am deducing," Holmes corrected, "and my deduction is that March was induced, through some combination of inducement and threat, to alter his testimony. The firm representing the tenants was, I have discovered, your own employer at that time, Mr. Fenwick. You were the junior solicitor assigned to the case. You would have had access to March's preliminary reports. You would have perceived the weakness they created in your client's position, and you would have been under considerable pressure from your superiors to secure a favourable outcome." Fenwick rose abruptly, moving to the window. "You paint me as a villain, Mr. Holmes." "I paint you as a young man placed in an impossible position," Holmes replied, his tone softening. "I do not believe you conceived the plan to suborn March's testimony, but I believe you were made party to it, perhaps unwillingly, and that knowledge has burdened you ever since." There was a long silence, broken only by the rain against the window-panes and the ticking of the clock upon the mantel. When Fenwick finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "I was 24 years old. I had been qualified not 2 years. The senior partner called me into his office and explained that March had been persuaded to see reason. That was the phrase he used, persuaded to see reason. I was instructed to prepare the documentation reflecting March's revised conclusions. I objected. I was told that objection would result in my immediate dismissal and the ruin of my prospects. What would you have done, Mr. Holmes, at 24 with your entire future at stake?" "I cannot say," Holmes admitted, "but the matter did not end with March's perjured testimony." "No," Fenwick agreed heavily. "The case proceeded. Ashworth fought valiantly, but the altered survey evidence proved devastating. His own solicitor advised settlement, warning that judgment would likely go against him entirely. The settlement was crafted to appear generous, preserving Ashworth's dignity while ceding most of the disputed land. But Ashworth knew the truth. March's earlier report had been shown to him by someone. I never learned who, though I suspected one of the clerks, perhaps Pritchard, who had sympathised with the young man's plight. And Ashworth threatened to expose the fraud, Holmes prompted. He spoke of it. The senior partner was alarmed. There were meetings from which I was excluded. I heard rumours of further inducements offered to Ashworth, of pressure brought to bear through his creditors. The atmosphere became poisonous with conspiracy and fear. And then, 6 months after the settlement, Ashworth died in what was ruled a riding accident. Holmes returned to his chair, his expression grave. "You believe it was murder?" "I know not what I believe," Fenwick said, his composure finally crumbling. "I know only that Ashworth's death was convenient for many parties, that the investigation into it was perfunctory, and that shortly thereafter the disputed land was sold to a development company in which the senior partner held shares. I was sickened by it all, Mr. Holmes. I left that firm within the year and established my own practice, determined to conduct myself with integrity. But I could not escape the knowledge of what I had witnessed, what I had, however reluctantly, participated in." "And the others?" Holmes asked. "March, who committed the perjury. Pritchard, who was clerk then as now. March rose in his profession, as did I. He became a surveyor of repute, then qualified as a barrister. I suspect the guilt troubled him, but he bore it silently as we all did. Pritchard remained a clerk, though he might have advanced further. I've sometimes wondered if he declined promotion, out of a sense that he deserved no better, having been complicit, however minimally, in such wrongdoing. A pact of silence, Holmes observed, binding you all together across the decades, each knowing what the others knew, each fearing exposure, yet none willing to speak. Until now, Fenwick said. When Mrs. Delamere's current inheritance claim required examination of those old records, when the possibility arose that the truth might finally emerge, the deposition papers you seek, Mr. Holmes, contain the original testimony given before March was suborned. They would prove the fraud, demonstrate the perjury, perhaps even cast doubt upon the verdict of accidental death. Their existence threatened to destroy everything we had built upon that foundation of deceit. I found myself profoundly moved by Fenwick's confession. Here was no hardened criminal, but a man who had made a terrible choice in his youth, and had spent the remainder of his life attempting to atone for it through honest practice and upright conduct. Yet the past would not release its hold upon him. "Who took the papers, Mr. Fenwick?" Holmes asked. "Who, among your confederates in that old wrong, feared exposure most acutely?" Fenwick shook his head. "I do not know. I swear to you I do not know. When I discovered they were missing, my first thought was that I should be relieved. Their disappearance meant safety, an end to the threat of revelation. But then I realized that their absence was itself suspicious, that inquiry would follow, that the very act of suppressing them might expose what we had sought to conceal. I engaged you, Mr. Holmes, in the desperate hope that you would recover the papers quickly, before anyone thought to ask why they were important enough to steal. A hope I have disappointed," Holmes observed dryly, "for I have asked precisely that question, and in seeking its answer, I have uncovered rather more than you wished revealed." "What will you do?" Fenwick asked, and in his voice I heard resignation rather than defiance. Holmes was silent for a moment, his fingers steepled before him. "I am engaged to find missing documents, Mr. Fenwick, not to serve as judge and jury for crimes committed before I was consulted. But I will say this. The truth has a persistent quality. It may be buried, obscured, denied, yet it remains truth nonetheless. And it has a way of surfacing when least expected, demanding acknowledgement and resolution. Your pact of silence has endured for 20 years. I suspect it will endure no longer." After Fenwick had departed, I found myself wrestling with conflicting emotions. "Holmes," I said, "what he described, this conspiracy to pervert justice, it is intolerable. Yet I find myself pitying him." "As do I, Watson," Holmes replied quietly, "which is why I shall pursue this matter to its conclusion, not for vengeance, but for truth. Somewhere among the parties to that old wrong is one who has acted in the present to protect their secret. That person may be Fenwick himself, despite his protestations, or it may be March or Pritchard or even some party we have not yet identified. But I shall discover them, and in doing so, perhaps provide a measure of justice for James Ashworth, whose death has gone unquestioned for far too long." The rain continued into evening, and I sat long by the fire contemplating the tangled web of guilt and fear that Holmes was systematically unravelling. Chapter 7. The Convenient Culprit. The morning following Fenwick's confession brought an unexpected development in the form of Inspector Lestrade, who arrived at Baker Street with an air of professional satisfaction that immediately aroused my curiosity. I had always found Lestrade to be among the more capable of the Scotland Yard detectives, possessed of sound instincts, if not Holmes's extraordinary powers of deduction, and his evident pleasure suggested he had made progress in the official investigation. Holmes greeted him cordially and gestured him to a chair. "You bring news, Lestrade. I can see it in your expression." "I do indeed, Mr. Holmes," Lestrade replied, accepting the seat and declining Holmes's offer of tobacco with a quick shake of his head. "News that I believe will bring this matter to a swift conclusion. We have identified the party responsible for the theft of the deposition papers and the assault upon Mr. Fenwick." "Indeed?" Holmes said, his tone carefully neutral. "Pray enlighten us." Lestrade drew a notebook from his pocket and consulted it with the deliberation of one presenting a carefully constructed case. "The evidence points unmistakably to Mr. Pritchard, Fenwick's senior clerk. Consider, if you will, the facts as we have established them. First, Pritchard had unrestricted access to Fenwick's chambers and knew the combination to the safe. No forced entry was necessary for the initial theft because he could simply walk in and take what he wished. That much is evident," Holmes acknowledged. "Continue." "Second, Pritchard's behaviour throughout has been suspicious. He has been nervous, evasive, and on several occasions has provided contradictory statements regarding his movements. When questioned about the evening of the assault on Fenwick, he claimed to have been at home, yet his landlady states he returned later than usual near midnight with his clothing dishevelled. I found myself leaning forward with interest. These were details I had not previously heard, and they painted a damning picture. Third, Lestrade continued, warming to his theme, we have established motive. Pritchard has been in Fenwick's employ for 27 years, yet has never risen above the position of senior clerk. His salary, while respectable, is modest. We have learned that he has accumulated debts through unfortunate investments in railway shares. A man in such circumstances might well be tempted to theft, particularly if he believed valuable documents could be sold to interested parties. You have evidence of such a sale? Holmes inquired. Not direct evidence, no, Lestrade admitted. But we have learned that Pritchard was observed in conversation with a stranger outside a public house in Cheapside 3 days before the papers went missing. The description of this stranger matches that of a known intermediary in the trade of stolen documents. We are attempting to locate this individual for questioning. Holmes had been listening with that peculiar stillness which indicated intense concentration. What of the assault upon Fenwick? How does Pritchard fit into that sequence of events? Lestrade consulted his notebook again. We believe Fenwick had begun to suspect Pritchard's involvement in the initial theft. He may have confronted him, or Pritchard may have feared imminent discovery. In either case, Pritchard returned to chambers that evening and attempted to stage a burglary that would divert suspicion. When Fenwick unexpectedly appeared, having remained late at work, Pritchard was forced to strike him down to prevent recognition. Yet Fenwick claims not to have recognised his assailant, I objected. The lighting was poor, Lestrade countered. And Pritchard is a familiar presence. Fenwick may have seen him without consciously registering his identity, particularly given the shock of the attack. The mind plays curious tricks in such circumstances, Dr. Watson, as I'm sure you're aware from your medical training. This was plausible enough, and I found myself nodding in agreement. Holmes, however, maintained his thoughtful silence. Finally, Lestrade concluded, there is the matter of the forced safe. Our examination revealed that while the lock was indeed damaged, the mechanism showed signs of being opened correctly before the damage was inflicted. Someone who knew the combination opened it, removed or examined certain items, then deliberately damaged the lock to simulate forced entry. Who else but Pritchard would know the combination? Fenwick himself, Holmes observed mildly. Come now, Mr. Holmes, you cannot seriously suggest that Fenwick assaulted himself and destroyed his own property. I suggest nothing, Holmes replied. I merely note the logical possibilities. Your case against Pritchard is circumstantial but coherent. Have you arrested him? Not yet. We are building our evidence carefully, but I expect to take him into custody within the day. I wanted to inform you first, out of professional courtesy, and to inquire whether your own investigations have uncovered anything that might bear upon the matter. Holmes rose and moved to the window, gazing down upon Baker Street. I have uncovered a great deal, Lestrade, though whether it bears upon Pritchard's guilt or innocence remains to be seen. Tell me, in your investigation, have you explored the history of the documents in question, their origins, their significance beyond mere monetary value? Lestrade appeared somewhat taken aback. The history? Mr. Holmes, they are legal depositions from some old property case. Their value lies in their relevance to current litigation, nothing more. You're certain of that? I am certain that a man drowning in debt would not concern himself overmuch with historical niceties, Lestrade replied with a touch of asperity. He would see valuable documents and an opportunity. The rest is irrelevant. Perhaps, Holmes said, returning to his chair, or perhaps the rest is everything, and what appears obvious is merely the surface of a deeper truth. But I will not detain you further with philosophical speculation. You must proceed as your evidence directs. After Lestrade had departed, I turned to Holmes with some excitement. He makes a compelling case, does he not? Pritchard had means, opportunity, and motive. The circumstantial evidence, while not conclusive, points strongly in his direction. Holmes had settled into his armchair and was filling his pipe with that black shag tobacco he favoured for difficult problems. Lestrade has indeed constructed a plausible narrative. Too plausible, perhaps. How can a case be too plausible? When it answers every question without raising any new ones, Watson. When it ties all loose ends into a neat bow and presents us with a solution that requires no further thought or investigation. Real crime is rarely so accommodating. You doubt Pritchard's guilt. I doubt easy answers, Holmes replied, applying a match to his pipe. Consider what Lestrade has told us. Pritchard is nervous and evasive, yet we know from Fenwick's confession that Pritchard has carried the burden of that old conspiracy for 20 years. Would such a man not be nervous when the past threatens to surface? His contradictory statements about his movements, might these not reflect a desire to conceal not criminal activity, but merely private business he wishes kept confidential? His debts are real, certainly, but many men have debts without resorting to theft. What of the stranger in Cheapside? I pressed. The known dealer in stolen documents. A suggestive detail, I grant you. Yet consider how conveniently it supports the theory. Lestrade admits they have not located this individual, cannot confirm the conversation's content, and possess only a description that matches many men in London. It is evidence that appears substantial, but may prove entirely insubstantial upon close examination. I found myself less certain than before. Then you believe Pritchard innocent? I believe nothing yet, Holmes said firmly. I observe that the case against Pritchard, while superficially convincing, rests upon the assumption that this is a simple crime of theft, motivated by financial need. It ignores entirely the historical dimension we have uncovered. It treats the deposition papers as mere commodities rather than as dangerous evidence of past wrongdoing. And most tellingly, it absolves all other parties of suspicion, providing them with a convenient scapegoat upon whom to lay all blame. He drew deeply upon his pipe, exhaling a cloud of aromatic smoke. Consider who benefits from Pritchard's arrest, Watson. Fenwick is relieved of suspicion, March similarly. Even Mrs. Delamere is protected from awkward questions about her knowledge of the conspiracy. The case is closed, the papers presumed destroyed or sold, and the past remains safely buried. It is all remarkably convenient. You suggest the evidence has been manufactured? I suggest that evidence must be examined critically, not accepted at face value merely because it forms a coherent narrative. Lestrade is an honest man and a capable detective, but he sees what the evidence shows him. He has not, as we have, delved into the history of the Ashworth case. He does not know what we know about the Pact of Silence binding our principles together. He is solving the crime before him, not the crime beneath it. Holmes rose and began to pace, his restless energy finding outlet in movement. No, Watson, I am far from satisfied with Pritchard as our culprit. He may indeed be guilty. I do not exclude the possibility. But if he is guilty, it is not for the simple reasons Lestrade supposes. There are layers to this matter that the official investigation has not penetrated. And until I understand those deeper layers, I shall not be content with surface explanations, however plausible they may appear. I spent the remainder of the day in a state of considerable mental conflict. Lestrade's reasoning had seemed sound, his evidence compelling. Yet Holmes's scepticism had introduced doubt where certainty had briefly flourished. I found myself reviewing the facts we had gathered, attempting to see them through Holmes's more critical lens, and discovering that many details which had seemed to support one interpretation could equally well support another. By evening, Holmes had retreated into that state of profound contemplation which I knew better than to interrupt. He sat motionless in his chair, his eyes half closed, his fingers steepled before him, working through some complex chain of reasoning whose conclusion remained beyond my grasp. I occupied myself with the day's newspapers, but my attention wandered repeatedly to my friend, wondering what insights his remarkable mind was even then formulating. The fog had descended thick upon London, muffling the sounds of the street and wrapping Baker Street in grey obscurity. Within our rooms the fire burned bright and the lamps cast their warm glow, and yet I could not shake the feeling that we were surrounded by darkness, that the truth we sought remained shrouded in mists as impenetrable as those outside our windows. Somewhere in the city, Pritchard went about his business, perhaps unaware that Scotland Yard was preparing to arrest him. And somewhere, the true author of this elaborate deception, if Holmes was correct in his suspicions, watched and waited, confident that the investigation was moving in precisely the direction they had intended. Tomorrow, I suspected, would bring revelations. Whether they would confirm Lestrade's theory or overturn it entirely, only Holmes's continued investigation would reveal. Chapter 8. Holmes's quiet doubt. Holmes's scepticism regarding Lestrade's theory manifested itself not in dramatic pronouncements, but in a series of quiet, methodical investigations that occupied the following 3 days. He pursued these inquiries with such discretion that even I, his constant companion, was not always aware of their precise nature until their results became evident. It was a characteristic demonstration of his method, preferring silent observation and careful experiment to premature conclusions. On the morning after Lestrade's visit, Holmes announced his intention to call upon Pritchard at his lodgings in Clerkenwell. I accompanied him, uncertain of his purpose but curious to observe the clerk in his domestic setting. We found Pritchard residing in a modest establishment, a boarding house of the respectable sort that caters to professional men of limited means. His rooms, when we were shown into them, revealed a life of quiet orderliness. Books lined one wall, mostly works of law and history. A desk by the window bore evidence of careful record-keeping, with ledgers neatly stacked and correspondence filed in methodical arrangement. Pritchard himself received us with evident apprehension, though whether this stemmed from knowledge of impending arrest or merely from the strain of recent events, I could not determine. Holmes, however, showed no interest in interrogating him about the theft or assault. Instead, he engaged the clerk in conversation about his long service with Fenwick, the evolution of legal practice over the decades, and the changes he had witnessed in the profession. "You have been a clerk for how many years, Mr. Pritchard?" Holmes inquired with apparent casualness. 45 years, Mr. Holmes, come next Michaelmas. Said I entered the law as a boy of 15, and have served it faithfully ever since. A remarkable tenure. You must have witnessed many significant cases, accumulated considerable knowledge of legal procedure and documentation. Pritchard nodded, a flicker of pride crossing his worn features. I have seen much, sir. The law has been my life. Holmes rose and examined the books upon the shelves, running his finger along their spines. Including, I perceive, a thorough understanding of historical cases and archival research. These volumes on property law and testamentary procedure suggest a scholarly bent unusual in a clerk. I have always sought to improve my understanding, Pritchard replied. Mr. Fenwick has been generous in permitting me access to his library, and I have endeavoured to educate myself in areas that might prove useful. Tell me, Holmes said, turning from the shelves, in your long experience, have you ever encountered deposition papers from cases dating to the 1870s? Documents of that vintage must present particular challenges in terms of preservation and interpretation. I observed Pritchard stiffen slightly. On occasion, sir, old documents require careful handling. The paper becomes brittle, the ink fades. One must be meticulous. Indeed, and if one wished to authenticate such documents, to verify that they had not been altered or forged, what methods would one employ? Pritchard's response came readily, delivered with the confidence of expertise. One would examine the paper stock and watermarks, compare the ink composition against known samples from the period, analyse the handwriting for consistency, and verify that the content aligned with other contemporary records. It is exacting work, Mr. Holmes, requiring both technical knowledge and historical understanding. Holmes thanked him for his time, and we departed. Once in the street, I turned to my companion with some bewilderment. I confess I do not see the purpose of that interview. You learned nothing that bears upon his guilt or innocence. On the contrary, Watson, I learned a great deal. I learned that Pritchard possesses exactly the expertise necessary to authenticate historical documents. More significantly, I learned that he understands the methods by which forgery might be detected. A man with such knowledge would be unlikely to forge documents in a manner that could be easily exposed. Then you believe the altered documents we discovered were not his work? I believe they were created by someone less expert than Pritchard, someone who understood the need for alteration but not the subtleties of historical document analysis. The changes Holmes detected in Fenwick's papers were crude by the standards of professional forgery. Pritchard, with his 45 years of experience, would have done better. Our next expedition took us to a handwriting expert of Holmes's acquaintance, a Mr. Ashford who maintained rooms in Bloomsbury and had assisted in several of Holmes's previous cases. Holmes had brought with him specimens of handwriting from each of our principals, obtained through various means I did not inquire into too closely. He requested Ashford to analyse these samples against certain documents from Fenwick's files, particularly those showing signs of alteration. The expert worked for several hours, employing magnification and chemical analysis, comparing letter formations and pen pressure with scientific precision. When he finally delivered his opinion, it cast Lestrade's theory in an even more dubious light. The alterations to these documents, Ashford declared, indicating the pages Holmes had submitted, were made by someone attempting to disguise their hand. However, certain characteristics remain consistent. The forger has a tendency toward abbreviated letter forms, particularly in the terminal strokes. The pressure is uneven, suggesting either haste or nervousness. Most tellingly, there are traces of an underlying pattern that suggests legal training but not extensive clerical experience. Could the work be Pritchard's? Holmes asked directly. Ashford shook his head with confidence. I have examined the specimen you attribute to Pritchard. His hand is that of a professional clerk, measured, consistent, practiced over decades. These alterations were made by someone less experienced in the physical act of writing, despite possessing the legal knowledge to understand what required changing. I would say a barrister or solicitor rather than a clerk. Holmes appeared satisfied with this confirmation of his suspicions. We departed Ashford's rooms and made our way toward Gray's Inn, where Holmes had arranged to re-examine the scene of the assault upon Fenwick. The chambers were quiet at this hour, with most of the legal professionals departed for their midday meal. Holmes had secured permission to conduct his examination undisturbed, and he proceeded to do so with painstaking thoroughness. He measured distances from the safe to the desk, from the desk to the door. He examined the overturned chair from multiple angles, testing its weight and stability. He scrutinized the carpet with his lens, collecting additional fibres and particles. After perhaps an hour of this work, he straightened with an expression of grim satisfaction. Watson, pray observe this chair that was supposedly overturned during the struggle. I examined it as directed. It was a substantial piece of furniture, oak with leather upholstery, of the sort designed for long hours of sedentary work. Now consider, Holmes continued, the position in which it was found. According to the police report, it lay here, some 3 feet from the desk on its side, yet observe the pattern of wear upon the carpet. This chair has occupied the same position before the desk for many years. The indentations are deep and precisely defined. For it to have fallen where it was discovered would require it to be moved 3 feet and then overturned. Perhaps in the struggle, I began. A struggle between Fenwick and an assailant? Fenwick is a man of 60 years, not given to physical exertion. His attacker struck him from behind, by his own account, rendering him unconscious immediately. There was no prolonged struggle, yet we are asked to believe that this heavy chair was displaced 3 feet from its accustomed position. Why? The implication was clear. The scene was arranged. Precisely. Someone wished to create the impression of violence and disorder. They overturned the chair, scattered papers, damaged the safe lock, but they did so without considering the physical plausibility of their staging. A genuine struggle would have left different traces entirely. Holmes moved to the safe and examined once more the damaged lock mechanism. Lestrade observed correctly that this was opened with the combination before being damaged. But consider the nature of the damage itself. It was inflicted from outside the safe, with the door already open. One can see the direction of the tool marks. This was not an intruder forcing entry, but someone with access creating the appearance of forced entry after the fact. Then the entire assault was staged? I asked, my mind reeling at the implications. The assault upon Fenwick was real enough, Holmes replied. The blow to his head was genuine, though perhaps less severe than initially supposed. But the surrounding circumstances, the damaged safe, the scattered papers, the overturned furniture, these were theatrical additions designed to support a particular narrative. We returned to Baker Street in thoughtful silence. Holmes had systematically dismantled the case against Pritchard through patient investigation and logical analysis, yet he had not replaced it with an alternative theory. When I pressed him on this point, he merely shook his head. I have demonstrated what did not occur, Watson. What actually did occur requires further consideration. But I can say this with certainty. Pritchard lacks the specific knowledge that would have enabled him to commit this crime as it was actually perpetrated. What knowledge? I inquired. Knowledge of the deposition papers' true significance. Lestrade believes Pritchard stole them for money, to sell to interested parties. But the papers' value lay not in their market price but in their evidential content. They threatened to expose the conspiracy surrounding James Ashworth's death. Only someone who understood that historical context would have motive to suppress them, and only someone involved in that original conspiracy would possess such understanding. Then one of the others, I said, Fenwick, March, or even Mrs. Delamere. One of them, certainly, but which? That is the question I must now resolve. Each had motive. Each had opportunity, and each, I suspect, would have been willing to sacrifice Pritchard to preserve their own secret. Holmes spent the evening in deep contemplation, smoking pipe after pipe as he worked through the permutations of the problem. I knew better than to interrupt him at such times. Instead, I occupied myself with my notes, attempting to arrange the evidence in some coherent order, though the more I examined it, the more complex the matter appeared. The fog had lifted, and a clear night sky revealed stars above the London rooftops. Yet clarity of atmosphere did not bring clarity of understanding. We had eliminated the obvious suspect, demonstrated the inadequacy of the official theory, yet we remained without a definitive solution. The true culprit remained hidden, protected perhaps by our very inability to prove conclusively which of 3 equally probable suspects had committed the crime. It was not until the following morning that Holmes would reveal the crucial insight that would unravel the entire mystery. But that night, as I retired to my room, I could only marvel at the complexity of human deception and the extraordinary patience required to penetrate it. Holmes possessed that patience in abundance, and I knew from long experience that he would not rest until the truth, however deeply buried, was finally brought to light. Chapter 9. The Weight of the Past. The summons went out on the morning of the 4th day following our interview with the handwriting expert. Holmes dispatched telegrams to Fenwick, March, Mrs. Delamere and Pritchard, requesting their attendance at Baker Street that afternoon for what he termed a resolution of the matter. He also sent word to Lestrade, suggesting that the inspector might find the gathering of professional interest. I observed these preparations with a mixture of anticipation and trepidation, knowing that Holmes would not have assembled such a company unless he possessed conclusive proof of the culprit's identity. The afternoon was unseasonably warm for autumn, and Mrs. Hudson had opened the windows to admit what breeze might be found in the London air. Our sitting room, arranged to accommodate the expected visitors, took on the character of a peculiar tribunal, with Holmes positioned near the fireplace and chairs arranged in a semicircle before him. I took my customary seat somewhat to the side, notebook at hand, prepared to record what promised to be a remarkable exposition. They arrived separately yet within a quarter hour of the appointed time, as though some unspoken coordination governed their punctuality. Mrs. Delamere came first, her bearing as dignified as ever, though I detected in her eyes a weariness that had not been present at our first meeting. Fenwick followed, his recent injury still evident in the careful way he moved. Pritchard entered with the diffident air of one accustomed to occupying subordinate positions, taking the chair most distant from the fireplace. March arrived last, his professional composure intact but his gaze sharp and assessing as he surveyed the assembled company. Lestrade, who had arrived some minutes earlier, stood near the door with an expression combining curiosity and scepticism. Then he had made clear his view that Holmes was engaging in unnecessary theatrics, but professional courtesy had compelled his attendance. When all was settled, Holmes began without preamble, his voice calm, yet carrying an authority that commanded immediate attention. "I have asked you here to resolve the matter of the missing deposition papers and the assault upon Mr. Fenwick. Inspector Lestrade has constructed a theory implicating Mr. Pritchard, based upon evidence that appears, at first examination, persuasive. However, my own investigations have led me to a different conclusion, one rooted not in the present circumstances, but in events that occurred 20 years ago." March shifted in his chair, the movement almost imperceptible, but Holmes's keen eye caught it. "The key to this entire matter," Holmes continued, "lies in understanding what those deposition papers actually contained. They were not simply historical documents of financial value, as Lestrade supposed. They were evidence of perjury, of a conspiracy to pervert justice, and quite possibly of murder. To understand why they were stolen, one must first understand why they were dangerous." He proceeded to recount with admirable conciseness the history of the Ashworth case as we had uncovered it. He described the fraudulent survey testimony, the coerced settlement, and the suspicious death that followed. Throughout this recitation I observed the reactions of those assembled. Mrs. Delamere's face reflected sorrow and vindication in equal measure. Fenwick sat with bowed head, as though the weight of his confession were being made public for the first time. Pritchard's expression showed distress but not surprise, confirming his knowledge of these events, and March maintained an almost perfect stillness, his features composed, revealing nothing. 3 men were complicit in that conspiracy, Holmes stated. Mr. Fenwick, then a junior solicitor who prepared the altered documents, Mr. Pritchard, then a clerk, who witnessed the machinations though he did not participate directly, and Mr. March, who provided the false testimony upon which the entire fraud depended. Each has carried this burden for 2 decades. Each had reason to fear the deposition papers, which would have proven March's original survey contradicted his sworn testimony. "This is speculation," March interjected, his voice level but harder than before. "You have no proof of these allegations." "I have Mr. Fenwick's confession," Holmes replied quietly, "and I have the deposition papers themselves." The effect of these words was electric. Every person in the room started, and March's careful composure cracked for an instant before reasserting itself. "You have recovered them?" Lestrade demanded. "I have never lost them," Holmes said. "They have been in my possession for 3 days, having been delivered to me anonymously through the post. I suspect the sender feared that retaining them had become more dangerous than surrendering them, particularly given the direction of the official investigation." Holmes crossed to his desk and retrieved a packet of yellowed papers bound with legal ribbon. These depositions contained testimony given in the spring of 1873, before the settlement was reached. They include a survey report signed by Edwin March, then a newly qualified surveyor, describing boundary markers that align precisely with James Ashworth's claims. This report contradicts entirely the testimony March subsequently provided under oath. Many surveyors revise their conclusions upon further examination, March said, but his voice lacked conviction. Indeed they do, Holmes agreed, but they do not typically destroy their preliminary reports as you attempted to do. I've spent considerable time reconstructing your career, Mr. March. You were brilliant but impoverished, ambitious but lacking connections. The opportunity to assist in the Ashworth case presented itself, and you were approached, by whom I cannot say with certainty, though I suspect the senior partner of Fenwick's former firm, with a proposition. Your testimony would be rewarded, your career advanced, you accepted. Holmes paused, allowing his words to settle. The guilt troubled you, I think. You abandoned surveying shortly thereafter and pursued qualification as a barrister, perhaps seeking to distance yourself from the deception. You prospered professionally but never entirely escaped the shadow of what you had done. And when the current inheritance dispute threatened to resurrect the Ashworth case, you realised that those original depositions, if they still existed, would destroy everything you had built. March's hands, I observed, had tightened on the arms of his chair, though his expression remained controlled. You did not steal the papers initially, Holmes continued. That was done by Mr. Fenwick, acting out of panic when he realised their significance. But when Fenwick engaged me to recover them, you recognised the danger. A full investigation would uncover the historical context, expose the conspiracy. You needed to redirect the inquiry, to transform it from a matter of historical fraud into a simple case of contemporary theft. This is absurd, March protested. Why would I? You attacked Mr. Fenwick, Holmes stated, his voice cutting through the objection like a blade. You arranged to meet him at his chambers that evening, perhaps offering to discuss the case privately. When he admitted he had taken the papers himself in a moment of fear, you saw your opportunity. You struck him down, staged the forced entry to suggest an external intruder, and scattered papers to create the impression of a burglary. Your hope was that suspicion would fall upon Pritchard, whose financial difficulties and access made him a convenient scapegoat. Holmes moved closer to March, his gaze unwavering. But you made errors, Mr. March. Your staging of the scene was theatrical rather than realistic. The overturned chair, the scattered papers, they spoke of someone creating an appearance rather than documenting an actual struggle. More significantly, you altered certain documents while searching the safe, attempting to obscure the historical trail. But your handwriting, despite efforts at disguise, betrayed characteristics consistent with legal training rather than clerical experience. An expert I consulted confirmed this. You have proof of none of this, March said, though his voice had lost its earlier steadiness. I have the deduction, Holmes replied. Let me demonstrate its validity through your own behaviour. When I mentioned document alteration during our first interview at Gray's Inn, you displayed not ignorance, but calculation. You were assessing how much I knew. When you came to Baker Street with news of a blackmail attempt, you were actually testing whether I had discovered the historical context. Your eagerness to pay the ransom was not generosity but desperation. You hoped to recover the papers and destroy them before their content could be examined. Holmes returned to the fireplace, his expression grave. But the most telling evidence is this. You alone possessed both the historical knowledge to understand what the depositions threatened and the legal expertise to attempt their suppression through alteration of other documents. Fenwick was paralysed by guilt and fear. Pritchard lacked the sophistication to plan such a scheme. Only you combined motive, capability, and the calculating coldness necessary to assault a colleague in furtherance of self-preservation. The silence that followed was profound. March sat motionless, his face now pale, his earlier composure entirely abandoned. Lestrade had moved closer, his hand near his pocket where I knew he carried handcuffs. Mrs. Delamere was weeping quietly, whether from relief or renewed grief I could not determine. Mr. March, Holmes said more gently, you have carried this burden for 20 years. The conspiracy in which you participated resulted, I believe, in James Ashworth's death, though whether by design or unfortunate consequence may never be known with certainty. You have lived with that knowledge, allowed it to poison your success, and finally permitted it to drive you to violence against a man who shared your guilt. The past, as I remarked to Dr. Watson recently, has a persistent quality. It cannot be buried forever. March raised his eyes to meet Holmes's gaze. In them I saw not defiance but a terrible weariness, the exhaustion of one who has fought a losing battle against conscience and circumstance. "I didn't intend for Ashworth to die," he said, his voice barely audible. "I was told the settlement would resolve the matter quietly, that everyone would benefit. When he died, I convinced myself it was truly an accident. But I knew. I have always known." "And the assault on Fenwick?" Lestrade demanded, stepping forward. "I panicked. When he told me he had taken the papers, hidden them, I saw everything unravelling. Holmes's investigation would expose us all. I thought if I created the appearance of a violent theft directed suspicion toward Pritchard, the historical inquiry would cease. I struck him, staged the scene. I posted the papers to Holmes anonymously, hoping that their recovery would end the matter without revealing their content. I was wrong about everything." Lestrade placed March under arrest with quiet efficiency. As the barrister was led away, I found myself reflecting upon the tragedy we had witnessed. Here was a man of considerable ability and achievement, brought low not by inherent villainy, but by a single compromise made in youth, compounded by the desperate measures taken to conceal it. After the others had departed, Holmes and I sat in silence for some time. The afternoon light was fading, casting long shadows across our sitting room. "Justice has been done," I ventured finally. "A kind of justice," Holmes agreed, "though it cannot restore James Ashworth to life, nor return to Mrs. Delamere the husband she lost, nor erase the 20 years of guilt that Fenwick and Pritchard have endured. The past, Watson, exacts its own penalties long before the law becomes involved." He rose and moved to the window, gazing out upon Baker Street as the lamplighters began their evening rounds. "The memory of wrongdoing," he said quietly, "is a burden that cannot be laid down through time or distance. It travels with us, shapes our choices, defines our limits. March attempted to bury his guilt beneath professional success and calculated calm. But guilt, like truth, has a way of surfacing when we least expect it, demanding the reckoning we have long postponed." Chapter 10. The Long Reach of Memory. The weeks that followed Edwin March's arrest brought a measure of resolution to the affair, though not, I think, the satisfaction that typically accompanies the successful conclusion of an investigation. March was tried and convicted for the assault upon Fenwick, receiving a sentence of 3 years' imprisonment with hard labour. The revelation of his perjury in the Ashworth case, while adding weight to the judgment of his character, lay too far in the past to admit of formal prosecution, the relevant statutes having long since expired. The deposition papers, once the source of such anxiety and violence, were at last examined by the court in connection with Mrs. Delamere's inheritance claim. They proved, as Holmes had surmised, to contain testimony that directly contradicted March's later sworn statements, establishing beyond reasonable doubt that the original settlement had been procured through fraud. The judgment in the current case reflected this discovery, though the complexities of intervening transactions and the passage of time meant that full restitution of the Ashworth estate was impossible. Mrs. Delamere received a financial settlement that, while substantial, could not compensate for the years of uncertainty and the loss of her husband. I called upon her some weeks after the trial, finding her in the same Kensington drawing-room where Holmes had first extracted her confession. She received me with courtesy, though the marks of her ordeal remained visible in the shadows beneath her eyes and the new grey that had appeared in her hair. "Dr. Watson," she said, gesturing me to a seat, "it is kind of you to visit. I've been meaning to write to Mr. Holmes to express my gratitude for his efforts, but I confess I found it difficult to compose such a letter. How does one thank someone for exposing truths one has spent decades trying to forget?" "Holmes would say that truth requires no gratitude," I replied gently. "It exists independent of our wishes, and his role is merely to reveal what was always present." She smiled faintly at this. A characteristically austere view, yet I am grateful nonetheless. For 20 years I have lived with suspicion, wondering whether James's death was truly accidental, fearing that my own silence made me complicit in some terrible wrong. Now I know the truth, or as much of it as can be known. That knowledge brings no joy, Dr. Watson, but it brings a kind of peace. "And what will you do now?" I asked. "I shall use the settlement to establish a fund in James's name, providing assistance to young men of merit but limited means who seek to enter the legal profession. Perhaps some good may come from all this tragedy. Perhaps the memory of what occurred can serve not merely as a reminder of wrongdoing, but as an impetus toward justice." I found her resolution both admirable and deeply moving. She had transformed her grief and anger into something constructive, refusing to allow the past to poison her remaining years. Mr. Fenwick I encountered by chance some months later, outside the law courts in the Strand. He appeared diminished somehow, as though the exposure of his youthful compromise had removed some essential vitality. When I inquired after his health and circumstances, he responded with careful courtesy. "I have closed my practice, Dr. Watson," he informed me. "The scandal, while not resulting in formal disciplinary action, has made it impossible to continue in good conscience. I could not face my clients knowing what they would surely learn of my past. I have taken a position as legal advisor to a charitable foundation, work that allows me to make some small amends for my failures." "You are very young," I offered, "placed in an impossible situation." "I was old enough to know right from wrong," he replied firmly. "The fact that I chose wrongly, even under pressure, cannot be excused by youth or circumstance. Mr. Holmes was correct in his observation that memory preserves not only what we cherish, but what we must answer for. I am answering now, as I should have done 20 years ago." His dignity in acknowledging his fault impressed me greatly. Whatever weakness he had shown in youth had been tempered by 2 decades of guilt into something approaching wisdom. Of Pritchard I heard only indirectly, learning from Fenwick that the clerk had retired from legal practice entirely and removed to the countryside, seeking in rural solitude the peace that London could no longer provide him. He had been the least culpable of the conspirators, yet he too had borne the burden of knowledge and silence, and that burden had exacted its toll. It was upon a quiet evening in early winter, with snow beginning to fall upon Baker Street, that I had occasion to discuss the case at length with Holmes. We had dined well, and he was in an expansive mood, willing to reflect upon matters he typically dismissed as resolved, and therefore no longer worthy of consideration. "The Ashworth case," I remarked, "troubled you more than most, I think." Holmes considered this, his pipe glowing in the firelight. "It troubled me because it demonstrated the limitations of justice, Watson. We discovered the truth, yes, and brought one guilty party to account. But what of the others? What of the senior partner who orchestrated the conspiracy, long since dead? What of the system that permitted such manipulation? What of James Ashworth himself, whose death remains officially accidental because proving otherwise would require evidence that no longer exists?" "Yet you achieved something," I protested. "March was convicted, the fraud exposed, Mrs. Delamere vindicated." "We achieved partial justice," Holmes corrected, "which is perhaps all that mortal effort can ever achieve. The past cannot be undone, Watson. The dead cannot be restored to life. The years of suffering cannot be reclaimed. We can only acknowledge what occurred and attempt to prevent its recurrence." He fell silent for a moment, gazing into the flames. What struck me most forcibly throughout this affair was the manner in which a single act of wrongdoing propagated through the years, touching everything it encountered. March's perjury led to an unjust settlement, which may have led to murder, which certainly led to Mrs. Delamere's decades of grief and suspicion. That original sin then forced Fenwick and Pritchard into complicity, burdening them with guilt that shaped their entire lives. And when the past threatened to surface, it drove March to fresh violence, compounding the original wrong with new crimes. "The long reach of memory," I said, recalling his phrase from our previous discussion, Indeed, memory is both individual and collective, personal and historical. We remember our own deeds, but the consequences of those deeds create memories for others, memories that persist and influence events long after we might wish them forgotten. March discovered this truth too late. He thought that time and distance would diminish the significance of his perjury, that professional success would somehow compensate for early compromise. Instead, he found that the past merely waited, patient and implacable, until circumstances aligned to demand its reckoning. I made notes of these reflections, for recognizing in them something worthy of preservation. Holmes rarely spoke so philosophically about his cases, preferring to focus on the mechanical aspects of deduction and evidence. Yet I knew that beneath his analytical exterior lay a deep concern for justice, and a profound understanding of human nature in all its complexity. "Do you believe March's remorse was genuine?" I asked. "I believe it was inevitable," Holmes replied. "A man of intelligence and education cannot maintain such a deception without cost. The very faculties that enabled him to succeed professionally also made him acutely aware of his own wrongdoing. His calculated calm throughout our investigation was not the indifference of a hardened criminal, but the desperate control of one who knew himself guilty and feared discovery at every moment. Then in some sense, he had already convicted himself long before you exposed him." "Precisely so. My role was merely to make explicit what his conscience had already acknowledged. The punishment the law will impose is secondary to the punishment he has inflicted upon himself through 20 years of guilt and fear." The snow continued to fall, muffling the sounds of the street and wrapping Baker Street in white silence. In that quietness, I found myself reflecting upon the curious trajectory of the case, from the simple report of missing documents to the exposure of a conspiracy that had poisoned multiple lives across 2 decades. "I shall write this case up," I said finally. "It deserves to be recorded, if only as a reminder that justice delayed is not always justice denied, and that the truth, however long suppressed, will ultimately demand acknowledgement." Holmes smiled slightly. "You may write it, Watson, though I suspect readers will find it less satisfying than your accounts of more dramatic affairs. There is no brilliant deduction here, merely patient investigation and logical inference. The solution was always evident in the historical pattern, once one thought to look for it." "That is precisely what makes it remarkable," I countered. "You saw what others missed because you looked beyond the immediate circumstances to the deeper context. Lestrade would have arrested Pritchard and considered the matter resolved. You recognized that the present crime was merely the surface manifestation of a past wrong, and you pursued the investigation until the entire truth emerged. The truth," Holmes mused, "an elusive commodity, Watson. Yet one worth pursuing despite its elusiveness, for in its pursuit we occasionally achieve not merely the resolution of individual cases, but a deeper understanding of the forces that shape human behaviour. This case taught me that memory is not passive but active, not merely a record of the past, but a force that continues to influence the present and shape the future." He rose and moved to the window, gazing out at the snow-covered street. James Ashworth died 20 years ago, yet his memory lived on in his widow's grief, in the guilt of those who wronged him, in the documents that preserved his testimony. That memory, properly understood and investigated, led us to justice. Not complete justice, perhaps, but justice nonetheless. I joined him at the window, watching the snow transform familiar London into something strange and beautiful. "Then memory itself becomes a kind of sanctuary," I suggested, "preserving what would otherwise be lost." "And a kind of snare," Holmes added, "capturing those who would prefer to forget, holding them accountable even when the law cannot. It is both, Watson. Memory preserves not only what is cherished, but what must one day be answered for. That is its burden and its necessity." The fire burned low as the evening advanced, and we stood together in companionable silence. 2 men contemplating the mysteries of justice, memory, and the inexorable passage of time. The case was concluded, the guilty convicted, the innocent vindicated so far as possible. Yet I knew that for those whose lives had been touched by the Ashworth affair, the true reckoning would continue long after the legal proceedings had ended, carried forward in memory's persistent hold upon the human heart. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the past and present alike in its cold embrace, yet changing nothing of what lay beneath. The truth remained, as Holmes had said, waiting to be discovered by those with the patience and courage to seek it out. And in that persistence of truth through time and circumstance, I found both warning and comfort, a reminder that while justice may be delayed, forgotten, or even denied, the facts themselves endure, waiting for their moment of revelation. Thus concluded the affair which I have titled The Mystery of the Lost Deposition Papers, a case less dramatic perhaps than some of Holmes's more celebrated investigations, yet one that revealed with particular clarity the principles that guided his work and the profound understanding of human nature that underlay his remarkable analytical powers.